welcome you all to the afternoon session, which is going to be about art and resistance. I'm Professor Alon Korngren. I'm the head of the Gonda Brain Center. I'm also active at the resistance across the country. I'm wearing one of my t-shirts. I have a collection of various organizations, and actually I should wear a quilt from all these, and which would be the artistic expression of my participation in many organizations. And I'm wondering why I haven't seen a quilt, a t-shirt quilt in one of the demonstrations. We will have the first presentation by Zoom by Dr. Einat Metzl from Bar-Ilan University, from the program for art therapy, Department of Jewish Art at Bar-Ilan, as I said, and she's going to talk about drawing from the impossibly complex cultural tensions and questions in art therapy training in Israel. Please, Einat.
Thank you very much. So I'm truly honored to take part in this conference, which is happening at such a critical moment in Israeli history. Regardless of the content of what I and others may say, the sheer fact that such a gathering is taking place at Bar-Ilan to consider the meaning of nonviolence resistance is of merit, I believe. It is a statement that we, as a member of the academia locally and globally, are willing to direct our gaze into the call of the moment, attempting to use our reflective and scholarly tools to create path from a collective precipice. I therefore first want to extend my deep gratitude to Professor Meir, Professor Heine, and Professor Salzberg for initiating and holding the conference. I also deeply apologize for not being with you today. I was grateful to be there yesterday. A testimony to the importance of the interdisciplinary discourse at this time can perhaps be illustrated by the modifications I already made in this presentation, which unfortunately, therefore, will not focus on art as our revolutionary and non-resistance tool all in all, but is propagated by the inspiring presentations yesterday and today. My intention is really to bring forth the complications of this time to problematize, like Dr. Yuval was saying, exploring the impact and meaning of resistance within the multi-layered power dynamics of culture, specifically within my small field of art therapy and the small program that I chair. The experiences I share here today are based on two aspects of my professional identity. The first is that I've been a facilitator of Jewish, Arab, and religious secular dialogues earlier in my professional career, and later as an art therapy professor teaching cultural issues classes in the US, Mexico, Spain, and Israel. And the latter, the second, is that the last 2.5 years I spent chairing the Bar-Ilan graduate art therapy program, which in some ways can represent a microcosm of the power dynamic and cultural struggles in Israeli society, I believe. Speaking from the first perspective, and contrary to the statement made yesterday by Professor Freeman, I do consider dialogue groups and art dialogue groups as a form of nonviolent resistance. Of course, it is a different kind of resistance, if you will, much more an interpersonal rather than interpersonal resistance. It's a resistance to our tendency to collapse into stereotypic generalizations and simplistic, myopic explanation of cultural affiliation when we're threatened. I believe that seeing the other and inhibiting the possibility that we are the other and we can see the other is a deeply humanistic liberal act, and often a subversive, non-violent one. It is an engagement through art which inherently resists totalitarianism. Today, I would like to struggle with you about the usefulness and the possibility of such encounters in responding to the current surge towards distraction of liberal democracy, as Professor Mountner stated yesterday. There are, of course, limitations to the dialectic practices, and these revolve around our clashing narratives around freedom of expression, identities, and our chosen trauma narratives. So, art therapy How does art therapy come into this when we consider resistance, domination, power? Where does it meet therapy and art and training, which is a power relationship? How does disobedience and protest and use of power come within the spheres of control of therapist and client, of professor and student? And where is the place of conscientious objection in therapy? Do we have a claim for self-defense of liberal humanistic versus totalitarian religious beliefs within the frame of therapy? Professor Mountner made a distinction yesterday between normal times from our current bad times. That's perhaps useful in understanding the tensions we currently live with. May be helpful to consider how creative and reflective tools are differently effective in each of those. Nevertheless, the term normal should be qualified. Israel is a state chronically situated in struggle of existence. In many ways, the normal range for Israelis is not the norm in most other places around the world. I think we can agree that Israelis consider military operations, which include protecting civilians from bombs, as part of the necessary evil to maintain the current status quo. Many Israelis reside in areas where terrorist attacks occur periodically, and the great majority have somehow accepted the necessity of militarily occupying and fighting over a land that is also the home of the Palestinian people. Israel was formed out of desperation and crisis. We have established our shared narrative as survivors of the Holocaust, fleeing for violence and discrimination Jews face in many other countries as well, and the religious and historical pull to this place as a homeland. Thus, even in normal Israeli climate, we already reside in ongoing tectonic shifts between Jewish and democratic, between Jews and Arabs fighting and coexisting, and between our different ethnic and religious affiliation. Therefore, even in normal times, Israelis' identities include multiple groups perceiving themselves as outcasts, often as either removed from power or recently removed from power, recently gaining power after having been removed from power, and multiple collective traumas, different anchors for our perceptions of truth and justice. So where does art therapy in Israel fall into this? The Israeli art therapy community is as diverse as the country. Israel has 9 graduate programs, including 2 programs in universities and 7 in colleges across the state. Some are more religious in their affiliation, formal or non-formally so. There are regional affiliations with the north, with the center, with the south. Most of the students, a great majority, are women, so there's not much diversity there, a very feminine profession, with a wide range of SES, ethnic backgrounds, and ages. Art therapists, like most Israelis, have a wide range of national and geopolitical trauma exposure. For example, living under fire in the south, or in Yehuda and Shomron, survivors of terrorist attack, family members living with PTSD, 2nd and 3rd generation of Holocaust survivors, Nakba survivors, and other traumatic narratives of immigration or forced migrations outside and within Israel. Therefore, even in normal times, art therapy students face many questions that are culturally laden. For example, the therapist's role in sitting with countercultural questions. So, for example, if I have a secular therapist meeting with an ultra-Orthodox child or a family, what is the place of resistance, subversion, or cooperation when they discuss therapy, when they present issues, when they perceive what are, for example, the targets of therapy, how interventions are done? How do we understand individual versus communal perception of mental health? I want to propose here that dealing with biases, with our different cultural stances, and with the power dynamic in the room, the idea of therapy and art is by its essence subversive and provides a resistance to external narrative. It allows for a liberal way, a democratic way, a truthful way for a person to make a stance, to bring their voice, to have it heard. And it is mostly nonviolent. we have an ethical code, which we contextualize ourselves in, as in most medical professions. There are specific clinical practices, which also have their own culture and lead the way. And there's ongoing challenges regulating the profession within Israel, which are also very culturally laden for those interested. You might read more about it, specifically around the regulation of the profession and the fight over whether it can or should not be a graduate degree. We have tools in normal times, again, not the current bad times, that normally help us with dealing with challenges and cultural differences and figuring out what people, what therapists, what clients can do so we can take into account who we are and give voice to everybody and still be safe. So, for example, we work around systemic thinking, practicing communication models, such as nonviolence communication principles, IMIGO, EFT, for those who are familiar. There are models from within psychology that we utilize around cultural competency and cultural humility. And specifically, we use creative and expressive tools to give voice, increase awareness, knowledge, and skills in considering socio-cultural pitfalls and blind spots. Art making, of course, offers an active nonviolent stance within one truth. And so it allows us also to assist our, sorry, I have something here. Okay. It assists us in seeing each other. Here are some brief ways to look at how art illuminates cultural tensions and propels reconsiderations of oneself between students and in therapy. So here's an example of perception of an ultra-Orthodox student who's sharing her deep hurt about the way her family is being perceived by general Israeli society as a family of multiple children, where there are some challenges and traumas that are truly misunderstood in her experience. Here's an example of a different student who is naming how sensitive she is around how she dresses, given that she grew up in a more religious family. And at the time she was becoming more secular, received many comments that are still impacting the way she perceives herself today as a therapist with clients and therapists. We have cultural tensions around speaking about and around gender and sexuality, because these are also very culturally laden in our multiple societies. And finally, there are ways in which talking about the other, the identified others within Israel, which many of my students work with, also needs extra attention and is given a different voice through using art. However, in our Bar-Ilan program, there is also a different kind of cultural microcosm, which had become more enhanced over the last few months. The bad times, as Professor Mautner coined them yesterday. In a reality that is becoming more polarized, as Professor Salzberg contextualized yesterday, the delicate common ground of what is an acceptable expression of opinion, what becomes a protest, and what is a misuse of power, all got stirred up. Namely, in our Bar-Ilan art therapy program, the great majority of the faculty identify as secular, center-left-leaning women, as is the case with most art therapists in Israel, while our student population is composed of a majority of religious, often national Jewish, Orthodox, or ultra-Orthodox women, with many residing in Yehuda and Shomron. The power dynamic here compounds the meaning around the different perceptions of reality. So, for example, when the university decided to strike, we had an interesting situation. While our right-wing government uses or misuses, depending how you see it, its power to profoundly change legislation, fiscal and educational standards, the faculty chose to use or misuse, depending how you see it, their power to strike and express their opinion, leading students who lack the power to choose around the strike and often have to pay the cost of not meeting that day in many ways. And those students, in our case, often disagreed and felt like this was not their choice. So here is a question of harm. or potential harm that was discussed earlier today. We've had many more conversations about fearing one another and seeing one another as threats. So in the past, when there were contentions between students, between faculty, now there's a palpable sense of threat that myself, as a representative of a different group, or a student who's a representative of a different group, feel they bring to the field, to our meeting, to our encounter, even if they do or do not agree with the main proclamations made by their leaders. Is it okay or is it not okay now for a Haredi student to say that she no longer wants or can or is allowed to by her rabbi to see men? This is something, for example, that had never been brought up before. And this year had come up, among other reasons, because of some of the laws that had been discussed and suggested that one could choose who they treat. Is it okay for a student to identify as anti-LGBTQI or feel unprepared or unwilling to work with Arab clients? These are questions I had never experienced before in Israel or otherwise. They used to be very clearly unlawful, unethical, unacceptable. Well, this year, this all is being questioned by the general atmosphere we reside in. Students, therefore, from both sides, express their feelings of being unseen, unprotected, protesting, not clear which direction they're coming from, not being seen within a crowd. Students experience more discrimination when going to interviews, whether they are religious and going to less religious environments or vice versa. How do I then, as a chair of the department, help them deal with such acts? Is it okay for a school to say, well, we don't want a secular woman to work with our ultra-Orthodox children? What do we do with the question of shaming and harming their potential growing professional selves? And there's a lot of anger, a lot of feelings that we all deal with. What I'm proposing here today is that art, the sheer making of art and sharing of art, is a way of allowing ourselves to be and to be able to present ourselves in a way that is resistant of the current collective zeitgeist. So what do we do? Well, at a time of anti-democratic rise, none of these those are simple questions, I think. I think we have a role of directing our students, supervisors, faculty, using our creative tools to sit with one another, to recognize the differences and consider ways to resist simplifications and generalizations. I think these are still useful tools. We still offer cultural issues in art therapy intensive course. We've offered an art-based workshop for the faculty. We try to support our faculty and students in difficult dialogues and through thoughtfully engaging in demonstrations and petitions, and also weighing the cost benefit of each of those. Mostly, I hope we continue to struggle with the boundaries and limitation of cultural dialogue and resistance. Are we using our voice enough? Are we misusing our voices and our power? In response to Dr. Adam Schreiner's statement regarding the resistance of officials, I was thinking of how do I choose to enforce or ignore new laws and decrees that are seeming to come forth? For example, the question of the Palestinian flag, for example, other strikes, for example, serving or not serving all populations. Do we act despite and because of harm that might be caused to students and faculty? In some ways, the conversation about Walter Benjamin and the solitary struggle, I think, is one we sit with as academicians. And I think the art truly is helpful with that. All in all, these are trying times. I think we're called for more consciously seeking good and not evil, as phrased by our prophets, and as we were reminded yesterday. We have generations that have raised us to do so, and we have current activism within the shifting judicial and executive systems that we operate under. Perhaps naively, I hope we can remember our uniquely human ability to see the inner experiences of others in ourselves through ritual and art to resist autocratic and totalitarian poles individually and collectively. Thank you.